Good morning, everybody. So let's talk about sustainability. Sustainability has become a huge topic in the media, in the press, and you've seen it a lot in Cisco Live as well. If you go back to Cisco Live in Barcelona just in 2020, there was only one session there with the word sustainability in the title or the abstract. Fast forward to Cisco Live last summer in Vegas, there were 11 sessions and I gave 2 of those. Here at Cisco Live this time, there's over 20 sessions with the word sustainability in the title or the abstract. We're seeing it now coming up in talks about networking, about data center, energy management, and we're going to talk a little bit more about it in this session today. Gartner have put it into their top 10 strategic technology trends for 2023, and they say that IT needs to treat sustainability as a default in everything they do. As Laura said, for the last 23 years, I've been in the Cisco IT organization. For the last year and a half in that, one of the side projects I had was looking at sustainability inside of Cisco IT. So I'm going to share some of that as we go through the presentation today, just talking about what we did inside of Cisco IT, how we got our heads around sustainability, and how we built a framework for it. Now, I always think when I'm presenting to audiences here in Europe, Europe's more advanced in their thinking around sustainability, and there's probably quite a few people in the audience who may have already got started on their journey. If you have, I hope you'll get a comparison with what we're doing in Cisco IT, and if you haven't, then maybe get some tips on how you can get started. Now, for some people in the audience, you may be thinking that we've been doing this for a long time. This is a book published by a colleague of mine in Cisco IT, Doug Auger. In 2009, he published a book on Grow a Greener Data Center. In our data centers, we've been worrying about the environmental impact for a long time, about the energy we consume, about the water and other things. In Doug's book, a lot of the things he talks about, they still apply today. How we design a data center, the equipment we put into there, the best practices on operations, e-waste and recycling and things like that. What Doug didn't talk about, he didn't talk about net zero, because the concept of net zero didn't exist back in 2009. That came in with the Paris Agreement in 2015. He didn't talk about greenhouse gas accounting or Scope 3 emissions. The concept of Scope 3 emissions came out in 2011. So there's a lot of things which he didn't cover in here because they're new. And it's that language which is something which is really key for us to get our heads around in IT, because it's the language which is coming out in the legislation, it's the language our companies are using to report on, and we need to align and start to use the same language in IT. So what I'm going to go through, I'll go through a little bit about why now, so what's changed. Then I'll talk about how we went around building our IT sustainability strategy inside of Cisco. I'll show you the Cisco IT sustainability framework, and then I'll give you some examples of using that framework in our data center. And I'll talk a little bit about smart buildings at the end. I know you've already had talks yesterday from Jeremy Whitaker and Sam Wood on smart buildings. I saw some of the questions in the chat afterwards. So I won't go through the smart building story, but I will address some of the questions in there, because I thought there were some great questions after that session. So first of all, why now? What's changed? So I think a lot of us realize that this is an urgent global problem. It's in the press and the media all the time. United Nations said transitioning to a net zero world is one of the greatest challenges humankind has faced. And we recognize within IT, we're both part of the problem, and we can also be part of the solution as well. And as IT professionals, we want to do our part. How can we help? But we also know there's a lot of customer, investor, and employee pressure on us to be accountable for our environmental impact. You can see a couple of quotes on here. From McKinsey, 67% of consumers consider this to be an important purchasing requirement. So they look at the companies they're buying from. 69% of workers want to work for a company where they feel like their values and beliefs are aligned with that company. So there's a lot of customer, investor, and employee pressure. And there's a lot of legislation, reporting standards, and scrutiny. Capgemini did a survey of how many companies were reporting around greenhouse gas emissions and had a plan around sustainability, and how many IT departments in those companies had a plan. They found that this was just in 2021, only 18% of IT departments had a sustainability strategy. I think, again, more advanced in Europe, but we'll look at what we did in Cisco IT. And I do think there are some genuine business efficiencies and new opportunities we can get in this area as well. So let me talk you through how I went about building the IT sustainability strategy in Cisco. And I tend to think I went through 3 main phases. So firstly, researching the industry and understanding the viewpoints, and in particular, what were these new standards? What were the things that had changed that made the conversation around sustainability different to when we were focused about being greener? And to do this, I read a lot of books, watched a lot of videos on YouTube, read various different scientific papers. There's a lot of great material out there. There is also some misleading information. Some of the authors have published updates to things, and some of the old material is still being quoted. Some of it gets exaggerated in the press. So in the press, you might read about cat videos causing climate change and the carbon footprint of emails and things like that. So there are some good sensational articles out there. But there's also some good specialist training coming out. So ITIL has a module around sustainability, and Cisco has a certification for partners as well. So there's an increasing amount of material which is quality stuff you can pick from. I also spent time with our suppliers, finding out what the suppliers were doing and what we could take advantage from there, and talking with peers in CIO roundtables and CIO boards. And the framework I'll show you, we reviewed that with Gartner and IDC and got their feedback as well. There are a ton of different acronyms, and I won't go through all of those in this presentation, but I'll touch on a few of those. Now, let me first of all start by sharing some of the things I got by doing this background research. And the first one is it helped me to put IT in perspective. Now, for those of you who heard Gordon Thompson speaking yesterday, so Gordon quoted a couple of figures, and I'll give you the background to those particular figures. So on this chart, we'll look at the total greenhouse gas emissions for the globe, and we'll look at the part that we're responsible for. What's the digital part of that? So the total greenhouse gas emissions, you can see up the side of the axis here, it says billion tons of CO2e. Now, if you've not looked at these before, the E stands for equivalence. So CO2 isn't the only greenhouse gas. There's also methane, nitrous oxide, various hydrofluorocarbons. So you convert those into CO2 equivalents, and then you can plot it onto one scale. And we can break that looking historically to see what the trend has been in the past, and then looking forward. And when we look forward, we look at the 1.5 degrees C pathway. So that's what the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, has said we need to stay below in order to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. So if we plot out the historical trajectory for the last 50 years, you can see it's pretty much doubled over the last 50 years. So it's gone up from 30 to around about 60 billion tons of CO2e. So that's the current global emissions each year. And the 1.5 C pathway we have to follow looks like this. Now, there's many different pathways because they have to do lots of different modeling depending on the amount of renewable energy, how quickly that comes through, and other things. But it's a pretty extreme curve and drop we have to go through. So we've doubled over the last 50 years, and roughly speaking, over the next 50 years, we need to halve emissions every decade. So how much of that 60 billion tons is due to digital? So with digital, we typically add in all the ICT plus the entertainment and media. So you can see that broken down on this particular pie chart. So on the right-hand side in blue, you can see the user devices. This is all the laptops, smartphones, tablets. You then go round into green, into networks. Everything from our enterprise networks up through the mobile fixed networks. And then to the data centers. Again, everything from our enterprise data centers, the colos, the hyperscalers. Cryptocurrencies is big enough in terms of its footprint that it's called out on its own. And then you get through to the TV and consumer electronics. So digital combination of all of these things, because quite a lot of the time, the solutions involve both IT and entertainment and media. Round about 1.4 billion tons. So if you look at 1.4 billion of 60 billion, it's 2.5%, which is the number which Gordon Thompson quoted yesterday. Numbers do vary because there's not a ton of data calculating the digital footprint. And if you take into account truncation effects in the supply chain, some people estimate it may be 2 to 4%. But it's that sort of order of magnitude, 2 to 4%. If you hear numbers being quoted of maybe 1.5%, they might just be looking at the IT component of that, the user devices, the networks, and the data centers. Okay, so we got the 2 to 4%. So what does that mean for IT? Within IT, we have two responsibilities. So the first one is we have to do something about our 2 to 4%. And within that, Gordon talked about as this being the footprint of IT. We have to look at sustainable IT practices. How do we get more renewable energy? How do we go back to looking at the data center and making that greener? Cloud migration. You've got to pick your cloud carefully and make sure it's one where you're actually going to lower your emissions. Energy optimization across our networks and data center. Increase asset utilization. When we first deploy something, have we overspec'd it? Can we take some of the assets out? Equipment modernization. Maybe some of our old equipment is actually really energy efficient. It's time to upgrade. Extending the life of things that are working really well. When you're getting something new, maybe you can take advantage of remanufactured equipment, and then managing your suppliers. There's a lot of things we can do to manage our 2 to 4%, which we're responsible for. And if we do a good job of that, then, as Gordon says, we can look at the handprint of IT. IT for sustainability. And in that, it includes everything from connected transport, hybrid work, e-health, e-learning, e-commerce, smart buildings, smart grids, smart agriculture. There's a bunch of different solutions. The 15% is quite variable in terms of the analysis around this. There's no formal definition around something which some people call Scope 4 emissions, what you do in terms of reducing the emissions in other sectors. So the values which I quote, I've given some references at the bottom of that chart. Exponential Roadmap does calculations of the potential impact of digital in other verticals. Smarter 2030, there's been work by Mal Moodin at Ericsson around this. The numbers vary from 7 to 20%. So again, you'll see different numbers quoted, so we give a middle ground of around about 15%. So that's where the numbers that Gordon talked about yesterday come from. He talked about 2.5 and 15. I've got a range here, 2 to 4 to 15. Okay, so that's the first thing. First thing is getting a viewpoint of the industry, understanding we have a dual responsibility. We are responsible for 2 to 4%, but if we do a good job managing that, we can have a big impact on greenhouse gas reduction. The next thing I spent time researching was our own carbon emissions, working out what Cisco as a company was responsible for and how did we quote that. So I tried to work out what goals did we have, where did we report, who completed those reports, how did they do the calculations. I found they were already doing calculations on behalf of IT in some cases. What best practices existed in different parts of the company, and who could we partner with? So let me just share a little bit about what I found out as I did that. And again, you'll probably go through the same discovery journey in your companies. So first of all, I looked at the Cisco goal. Our goal is to be net zero for greenhouse gas emissions across our value chain by 2040. Now, net zero means that you've balanced out your emissions with some other offsets or something out there to get down to a net of zero. But there's a more formal process around that a lot of companies are now going through. So at the bottom here, I say it's been reviewed by SBTI, Science-Based Targets Initiative. So what SBTI do is they look at your goal, and the first thing they say is, that 1.5 degrees centigrade pathway that I talked about, are you meeting the 1.5 C pathway? So to do that, you have to be within 2050. Our goal is 2040, so yes, we're meeting that. They then look to see, are you doing it for all your scopes of emissions, 1, 2, and 3? So again, we're covering all scopes of emissions, and I'll go through that. They then look to see, as well as that long-term goal, have you got a short-term goals, which you set out over the next 5 to 10 years, so they can track progress. So there's a number of things that SBTI look at to verify whether you've got a credible journey towards net zero in your company. Now you can see Cisco's scopes of emissions in the pie chart on the right. So you can see our biggest part of the pie is the big part in blue, which is our Scope 3 use of sold products. So when we produce stuff and we sell it to you, you take our products, you plug it in, it uses energy, that produces greenhouse gases. That goes against your Scope 2, and that goes against our Scope 3. When we produce those products, we buy materials to do the manufacture of those. That goes into our Scope 3, purchase goods and services, which is 23%. From the IT side of things, that 23% also includes the indirect that we have for IT. So if we spend anything on AWS, various SaaS providers, that goes into that Scope 3 purchase goods and services. And then you've got everything else. The upstream transportation and distribution, the other Scope 1 and 2, and all the other scope categories. Now, some of you may not be familiar with the language around scopes, but this is something which is one of those fundamental differences. Now we're talking about sustainability rather than just the greener data centers. So I'll talk a little bit about the greenhouse gas protocol. So if you're not familiar with the language, hopefully you walk away and you're very comfortable with this. So this diagram shows Scope 1 and 2, and then Scope 3 is broken into two parts, upstream and downstream. So I'll start in the middle with Scope 1 direct spend, so that's a bit in blue. Scope 1 direct, these are the emissions your company is directly producing, either from the action which it has to produce whatever product you sell, or because you have things in it like boilers, furnaces, generators, you have company cars, things that are directly consuming fuel and producing greenhouse gases. So the Scope 1 direct is you directly producing greenhouse gases from your operations. Scope 2 indirect is when you're purchasing electricity and steam. In this case, you're not directly producing those emissions, but you still have quite a good control over the level of greenhouse gas emissions you produce in Scope 2 by the amount of electricity you consume. And then you get into Scope 3. So Scope 3 came out in 2011, and they just put everything else in Scope 3. So Scope 3 ends up with 8 subcategories upstream, 7 subcategories downstream. Upstream, you have purchase goods and services, capital goods, fuel and energy-related activities, transportation and distribution, waste generating operations, business travel, employee commuting, leased assets. So there's a ton of different categories in this. Going back to Cisco, if you plot us out on this, we would look like this. So very big on the Scope 3 downstream because of use of sold products, smaller on the Scope 3 upstream because of purchase goods and services, and the Scope 1 and 2 would be pretty small in comparison. This is fairly typical for somebody who produces IT equipment. If you go into a different industry vertical, go into transport services, it will look like this. In that case, transport services, it's a little like Cisco and our company cars, but in this case, they've got tons of transportation. That's consuming that fuel, so that goes directly into their Scope 1 direct. If you go into another industry vertical, food and beverage, they're buying a lot of goods to make the meals and the drinks that they're selling. So it's the Scope 3 upstream that becomes a big part. If you go into oil and gas, in their case, they're selling product that creates a lot of greenhouse gases on the downstream side. So again, it's that use of sold products that's very big. So different industry verticals have a different breakdown of Scope 1, 2, and 3. This chart, you'll have to download and have a look, because I know it's very small from the back, but I took the data from CDP. All the companies, they disclose their emissions on an annual basis to CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project. And you can take the data from there, and along the top, it's got the different industries, and down the side, it's got the different scopes, Scope 1, 2, 3, and the different subcategories. And you can group them together. So here I've grouped them by which are the scopes that have the biggest contribution to their overall emissions. So the blue is the ones with a big Scope 1. So cement, steel, they produce a lot of CO2, a lot of greenhouse gases during the production of cement and steel. Transport services, electric utilities, they consume a lot of fuel. You go down to the green, you're getting into high Scope 3 Category 1. Again, a lot of purchase goods and services for food, beverage and tobacco, agriculture, chemicals, real estate, high in Scope 3 Category 2, capital goods. You go down to metals and mining. They do a lot of processing of the goods, which consumes a lot of energy. So it's high in Scope 3 Category 10, processing a sold product. And then, of course, again, a lot with Scope 3 Category 11, like Cisco. Financial services, out on its own at the end. There, it has a lot of Scope 3 Category 15 because it has a lot of investments. So different industries will have a different footprint. And SBTI, the Science Based Targets Initiative, will have different guidelines for that industry about how to reduce emissions and how to calculate it based on your footprint. So what about Cisco? What's our strategy to get to net zero? So Cisco, again, a large part of our emissions is due to the use of sold product, due to you plugging in our equipment and it consuming energy. So not surprisingly, We have 5 strategies. The first strategy is we want to make more energy efficient technology so that we reduce that Scope 3 category 11. The next is we want to have more renewable energy, so we can use that internally. We also work with various electricity companies to try to help them produce more renewable energy and use that energy more effectively. Embracing hybrid work, that can help reduce the category which looks at business travel and telecommuting. Investing in innovative carbon removal solutions. So at the end, with SBTi, they say you have to remove a certain amount of your emissions, and the last 10%, you can look at carbon removal or offsets. So we invest in various solutions around that to try to get carbon out. And then embed circular economy across our business. Now, the next thing which I spent time looking at was the goals that we had around this. So understanding the strategies to get to net zero, but then looking internally at what were the different goals which we had along that journey to make sure that within IT we were aligned to those sub-goals. Now again, the goals part of this is quite small, but it has things about like the increasing amount of recycled plastic we use, look at the packaging that we're using, introducing circular design principles, which I'll come back into in a minute. But it also has things around targets for reducing our Scope 1 and 2. Well, in IT, we're responsible for some of the Scope 1 and 2. So it was important to know that in 2025, we're targeting a 90% reduction in Scope 1 and 2. So we can make sure that as we look at our data centers and our buildings, that's something we're aiming towards. So I spent time talking to the various different teams on the left-hand side and understanding how did the ESG team actually do the reporting? They were collecting a ton of data from across the company. So was that something that IT could help with? Could we help with the data collection? I talked to the circular economy team, the supply chain team, trying to understand about this concept of circularity. And I talked to procurement. Well, of course, we've talked to procurement for a long time. But the conversation with procurement was different to the one which I had in the past. So what I was talking to procurement about now was, we have a target for net zero in Cisco of 2040. What if one of our suppliers has a target for 2050? Do we have to change supplier? Do we have to tell them that they're going to be responsible for the carbon offset at the end of that? What other questions should we put into our RFPs? So it was a different type of conversation. Now, circularity is something which I've mentioned, and to some extent, this is something which I think everybody knows about, and they think that it's an intuitively obvious thing to do. On this slide, it shows the linear economy. Linear economy, you take materials and minerals out of the ground, you make something, and at the end, you dispose of it. Circular economy, you make things, you use them, and at the end, you reuse them and recycle them. It makes sense. It's something we talk to our kids about recycling and so forth. What's startling is when you look at the figures around this on a global basis, actually, a report was done, a Circularity Gap Report, came out in 2020, and only 8.4% of the world was circular in 2020. The update to the Circularity Gap Report came out in January 2023 this year, and it's gone backwards. As a planet, we've gone back now to 7.2%. So the planet is still very, very linear. Within the electronics industry, we're a little bit better. We're around about 17.4%, but that's still not very good. So we've got a big shift that we need to do in the way which we run our IT organizations to try to improve this. And it's really complicated to embed circularity because you can't just do it in one place. So inside of Cisco, we embed circular design principles inside the way we make products. We look at circular operations inside of our company. We look at circular consumption models with our customers and partners. We look at circular solutions and how we sell them. And then we work with our broader ecosystem and with various different alliances and so forth to try to look at standards and how we can move the whole of the industry along. Okay, so I've touched on understanding the viewpoints and trying to put IT in a bigger picture. I've talked a little bit about understanding our own company emissions. So the next bit was then trying to work out how do we go about building our IT strategy and setting some goals. So I spent time looking at our IT footprint, trying to work out where the opportunity was, drafted a framework. reviewed it with the various different service owners for the data center, network, and so forth, calculating a baseline, setting some goals, and then measuring progress. So the IT footprint looks a little bit like this. So this is from Gartner. So if you've now got that understanding of scope 1, 2, and 3, you can understand that IT obviously has quite a big scope too. We consume quite a bit of electricity in our data centers and running our network. But the biggest part is the scope 3, because we buy a lot of stuff. Even if we don't buy it, if we lease it, it'll still be in scope 3, because you can see leased assets is there in category 8 as well. So this is kind of like a typical IT footprint. Now, it'll vary a lot depending on how much you're outsourced, how much SaaS you use, how many user devices you have, but this is kind of what Gartner sees as the average. Now, you soon get into looking at your carbon footprint inside of the IT. So I'll give a few pointers if you haven't started looking at carbon footprint already. So first of all, what it is has a big impact on the carbon footprint. In this chart, it looks at 4 different items: a blade server, an IP phone, a laptop, and a smartphone. When you look at carbon footprints, they tend to look at it across the lifetime of the product. The manufacturing phase, the transport out to where it's going to be used, the use phase, and then the end of life. And you can see on these bar charts, they're dominated by blue, manufacturing, and orange, use. But it varies a lot depending on the product. So a blade server is almost 90% in the use phase, the electricity it consumes. Whereas a smartphone is like 80 to 85% in the manufacture, and it's a very small amount in the use phase. So what it is has a big impact on the carbon footprint. And that becomes important because now where it is has a big impact. If you take one particular product, in this case a WebEx Desk Pro, you can move it between different locations. That blue, the embodied manufacturing emissions, is going to be the same wherever you put it. So here we're moving it between Oslo, London, San Francisco, and Sydney. The blue is the same everywhere, but that use phase varies depending on how much renewable energy is in the local electricity grid. So you move it to Oslo, a lot of hydroelectricity, so the use phase is very small. You go to Sydney, there's still a lot of coal-based electricity, so the use phase becomes very big. So what it is has a big impact, where it is has a big impact, and then how many of them has a big impact. So while item for item, the stuff we have in a data center has a bigger carbon footprint than user devices, there's just so many user devices, we typically end up with a larger carbon footprint for the user devices than we do for networks and data centers. And you can see again, that split between blue, manufacturing, and use phase varies quite a bit by the different categories. Now, this is good to do, but obviously we're doing a lot of projects inside of IT, so we can't expect our architects and engineers to do a carbon footprint calculation and do a full lifecycle analysis every time they're doing a project. So I think what we want to do is get to the stage where our engineers and architects have a bit of a feel for carbon and understanding where the carbon-intensive parts of a system are. So if I take a simple system like this, and let's picture an activity. So it's a Saturday night, you're sitting at home, you're watching Netflix and enjoying a glass of wine, and you're wondering to yourself, where's the most carbon-intensive part of that activity of watching Netflix, and how could I reduce my carbon footprint? So the Netflix film starts in the data center. Well, the data center is spread between millions of people, so that's quite a small contribution to your footprint. It goes across to the WAN. Again, the WAN is shared by millions of people, so that's a small contribution to your footprint. That wired connection in your house, the router, it's just a few people in the house that are sharing the carbon footprint of that. And then it hits your big TV screen. So it's that TV screen that's probably the biggest contribution to your carbon footprint. If you wanted to reduce your carbon footprint watching Netflix, you could switch from a TV screen to an iPad, to watching it on a tablet or a laptop. But it's not one of the worst things that you could do. It's kind of equivalent watching a streaming video to boiling a kettle for 6 minutes. In fact, the glass of wine probably has a bigger carbon footprint. But it's this sort of systems thinking that I think we want our architects and engineers to get. So in the same way that they would intuitively know what the most expensive part of a project was, they can look at a system and they can see where the large parts of carbon are and where they want to focus to try to reduce that overall. But we don't want them just to focus on the carbon footprint. we want them to think about the products they're getting and how those are designed as well. So I talked a little bit about Cisco's circular design strategy. So we have circular design principles, and our aim is by 2025, all the new products that Cisco produce will go through these circular design principles. And they cover the materials we use, whether it's recycled, but also the volume of materials we use. The standardization, so are the components inside it standardized to make it easier for us to assemble, to make it easier to reuse when we get the product back, and to make it easier to service in life cycle. We look at the packaging, and we look at the accessories as well. Do we need to ship every product we sell with accessories? Or can you opt in or opt out of getting accessories or something? The power consumption. Gordon Thompson yesterday talked about Silicon One. So we're trying to make power consumption lower and also put power-saving modes in the products. And then reuse at the end. Can we do a better job of making them to make it easier to reuse? So a couple of examples of this in practice. So if you go to something like Cisco's UCX server, it's designed to be quickly assembled, but also quickly disassembled again. We want to make it so that when it gets returned to us, we can take it apart and easily harvest the parts out of that to reuse them. We have a lot of recycled plastic inside it, and we don't put a spray coating on the top of it, so it's easier for us to recycle it. In the middle, you've got an industrial router. It ships with a 4G module, but it's modular. If you want to go from 4G to 5G, you don't have to rip out all the devices. You just take that one module out and upgrade to 5G. And then power efficiency, as Gordon mentioned yesterday, Silicon One chips, much more power efficient, but also a lot of power efficiency modes going to the products, and increasingly dashboards and so forth to be able to expose information about power consumption to you. So we want architects and engineers to look at the products they're buying and think about how those are built and whether those are built in such a way that they can be circular. So what did we include in our IT sustainability framework? So there were 4 main things. So firstly, we wanted to make sure we were aligned to that Cisco strategy and to the various goals that we had within the company. And we also wanted to see how we could help with the reporting standards that we had in the company, all that data collection. Second, we want to look at circularity. What did circularity look like inside of our IT organization? How could we bed it into the IT services lifecycle? And we looked at it in 4 simple places. How we design stuff inside of IT, how we buy it, how we operate it, and then what happens to it once we've finished. Then we looked at some special areas of focus. When we started this, we were looking at around about power management and energy management because we were conscious there was a target around scope 1 and 2. But increasingly with the energy crisis, this has become even more important. And then we wanted to have it supported by culture. We wanted to have this as being something that everybody understood what the goals were, and they were trying to help it as well with other innovations. So this is the framework we came up with. And I'll quickly go through this and relate this back to those 4 bits. So at the top, this is how we got the alignment with Cisco overall. So aligned to our net zero goals, putting the 5 strategies I talked about, which we have for getting to net zero in there, and then looking at how we could help with the reporting requirements. These next 4 are how we embedded circularity inside of our framework. So looking at how we design, how we buy, how we operate, and how we do recovery and reuse at the end. So how we design things. That idea of circular design principles that Cisco has in its products. What do we want to have inside of IT as our IT design principles? Getting into life cycle and systems thinking. Getting it so our architects and engineers are looking at a full system, and just like I gave with the Netflix example, they're starting to think about where's the carbon intensive part of that I should be trying to optimize. And reviewing the project overall with clients. Do I really need to keep 10 years of data in this database, or can I keep 5 years? So working out with clients, can you reduce the service level or the overall requirements to try to reduce the carbon footprint? Looking at responsible procurement. So with our procurement organization, we started to think about how we could apply some of the things they did with manufacturing and logistics inside of IT. They do a simple thing. They ask all of our suppliers, do they submit to CDP? Do they make the CDP submissions public? Do they have them audited? Do they have the goals? And do they do the same with their own suppliers? And then getting through operations and asset recovery and reuse. Energy management, working with our facilities team on how we source renewable energy and how we maximize efficiency and monitor the usage. And then lastly, as I mentioned, employee culture. So this was the framework that we built up inside of IT. But again, you don't get to circularity just by doing things within your IT organization alone. You then need to try to work out how you get that closed loop with suppliers. So we need to increase the amount of our product when we take it out that comes back. So there's various different Cisco solutions that we offer to help do that. So we have Cisco Refresh. So during that design phase, your architects might look and say, actually, we don't need to have something new. We can deal with something remanufactured. So Cisco Refresh offers that. We have Cisco GreenPay, where there's an incentive for buying things and returning it at the end of the cycle to Cisco. We have various dashboards, so operations can look to see how they can optimize things when they're in use. And then we have the take back and reuse program at the end, where Cisco will do a free take back of products. And then we close the loop by doing remanufacturing and taking these things apart and reusing parts and so forth at the end. There's also energy management. So CX have launched an energy optimization assessment service. So again, it recognizes that this is something which we're really wrestling with the energy crisis. So there's a bunch of things that Cisco offer, and there's probably a lot of things that your other suppliers offer to try to get these closed loops and increase circularity. So just to give a quick example of how this works in our data center. So this is a white paper that we published last summer, and it took the framework and then it applied to our data center inside of Cisco. So how we introduced new global design standards. From that, how we looked at it upgrading to the latest UCS gear, starting measuring the amount of reduction in power in watts per virtual machine, and deploying ACI everywhere so we didn't have any stranded capacity. From this, we recognized that we probably had too many data centers and we didn't have enough power going to each cabinet. So we got into a data center rationalization. We reduced the number of data centers IT was running from 26 down to 16. We then saw a 40% reduction in the power that we were consuming, and we got 23% reduction in OpEx costs, which allowed us to then start doing upgrade of some of the infrastructure we had. And as we took apart those data centers, we took out 43 tons of cabling infrastructure, and then we worked hard to make sure we reuse that in other data centers and labs. And there was a big focus on the employee culture in the data center as well. So even getting down to the stage of our data center operators would be quite used to when they plug something new in, they'd take a new patch cable because they didn't want to have a bad patch. And they felt good because at that stage they were just throwing the old patch cable into a recycling bin. But we worked with our suppliers, and we worked out a new process to recertify patch cables. So rather than reusing them, rather than recycling them, we started reusing old patch cables, and now 90% of the patch cables we reuse over again. We also have on-site solar panels, which produce 1.8 megawatts. We use airside economizers to take advantage of any cool air in the evenings and the winter to suck that in to try to reduce the amount of air conditioning we have in the data center. And then we do a lot more on cooling optimization. You can see in the photo there, the chimneys go right up to the ceiling. At the top, we have cray hoods, pull out the hot air, cool it down, push it up through the bottom. We replace the perforated tiles with samurai tiles to get cold air going higher up the cold air aisles. And then we do infrared audits once a quarter to look for any heat loss, and we put in blanking and wrap gap panels and tar cut foam to try to reduce any heat loss. And then we have various monitoring systems that look to see if we're doing a good job of optimizing it. So this is all written up in a case study, so if you want to go to cisco.com, you can find how we use the framework in our data center. Now, yesterday, they presented the case study around smart buildings and Pen 1. So I'm not going to go through that case study again. But I saw the questions in the chat about more switches and whether that was consuming a lot of power and how often you'd have to refresh the switches running Pen 1. I also saw the questions around OT and around the security problems that might introduce. These are exactly the right questions to ask. Again, going back to the beginning, IT has a dual responsibility. So one, We need to manage our 2 to 4%. So the questions people are asking are exactly the right questions. How can we optimize the IT footprint in this? But equally recognizing IT can have a bigger impact. If we do a good job of the 2 to 4%, we can have a big impact on reducing greenhouse gas emissions elsewhere. And buildings are 37% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. So there's a big prize to be had if we can do a good job of looking after our infrastructure. So again, the questions were the right ones. How can we make this model work so we can help the business with doing things like smart buildings? This will also become important because with climate change, there's going to be more heating problems and other things which come to our buildings as well. Last summer, July the 19th, there was the heat wave, and Google and Oracle both had outages in their data centers in the UK because there were unexpected high temperatures and it couldn't cope in their data centers. So things like smart buildings can help us reduce power, but hopefully they can also help us adapt to the climate change as well as things go on. Now, I've talked about a lot of figures and so forth. If you want to find some of the figures, there's descriptions on Cisco's ESG Hub that goes through the breakdown of our emissions, gives more detail about some of the examples. And I'll just wrap up with the key takeaways. So, United Nations and IPCC talk about this as being the decade of action. So as you saw from that graph at the beginning, we've got a lot to do to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. If you haven't started already, 3 steps, which I went through in order to produce the strategy for Cisco IT, researching the viewpoint and the standards. The main thing that's changed in the conversation around sustainability is the language that's being used, those standards. Understand your company goals. Understand how you as IT can support the reporting, can support making sure you achieve the goals, and then build your IT strategy. Think about the concepts I've talked about, the dual responsibilities of IT, in how you embed circularity, how you get your architects and engineers to think about things as systems, where you drive energy efficiencies and asset utilization, how you manage your supplier base, and the new questions you ask with procurement. Can you help with the data collection for the company? And lastly, there are some things which you can find out while you're here at Cisco Live about some of the offerings that we have. So there's a sustainability zone just over in the IT Hub, and it goes through some of the new products and solutions we have. It talks about Cisco Refresh, Cisco Green Pay, the product take-back programs, and the energy optimization service. So if you want to find more about how those can help you, then pop along there and ask. And lastly, share what you learn. So I don't think any of us are going to solve this problem on our own. I've shared today what we've been trying to do in Cisco IT, and would love to hear from all of you about what you're doing, and see if we can make a big impact on this together. Thank you very much.